On a stormy night in the mountain town of Ashridge, a humble father named Elias Marrow received a simple scratch-off ticket from his daughter Clara while she gifted her wealthy father-in-law a lavish Arctic voyage. What began as an insult soon unraveled into a shocking betrayal when Elias discovered his savings had been stolen to fund that extravagant gift. Just as despair seemed to consume him, the forgotten ticket revealed a fortune that would ignite a battle of greed, lies, and public humiliation. Allies and enemies rose against him, and family bonds were torn apart as truth clashed with deception in the eyes of the entire town. In the end, Elias faced a choice that would decide not only his legacy, but the future of those who betrayed him. This is a story of betrayal, redemption, and the power of dignity in the face of greed. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Now let us step into the firelit lodge of Ashridge, where this unforgettable tale begins. The storm rolled down from the high peaks of the Ashridge Mountains, carrying with it the howl of wind and the icy touch of sleet. The Marrow family lodge, built of heavy beams and stone, groaned under the weight of the storm, but stood firm as it had for generations. Inside, the fire in the great hearth cast golden light across the walls, softening the shadows of portraits that watched silently from their frames. The warmth was a shield against the raging night outside, but it could not calm the unease that pulsed quietly beneath the laughter and chatter. Elias Marrow entered the hall slowly, leaning on the cane he had carved himself years ago. His coat was worn, his boots damp with melted snow, but his back was straight, his face calm. The family gathering for Clara's celebration was not his idea, but he had come because he believed it was his duty. Despite the distance that had grown between him and his daughter, Elias still clung to the hope that tonight would hold some small warmth, a reminder that family, no matter how strained, was worth preserving. The long table was crowded with relatives, voices overlapping, plates clattering, and glasses raised in cheer. Clara sat near the head of the table, her smile bright but sharp, her every gesture carrying a sense of control. Beside her was her husband, a man of quiet ambition, and across from her sat Victor Hale, her father-in-law, whose presence dominated the room without effort. Victor was a tall man with the confidence of wealth. His polished coat, silver watch chain, and calm authority made him the center of every glance. Clara's eyes followed him often, her admiration clear. Elias lowered himself into a seat at the far end of the table. Few noticed his arrival. He placed a small wooden box beside his plate, a box he had crafted with his own hands. Inside lay the gift he had brought for Clara, something modest but made with love. For all his life, Elias had worked with wood and iron-shaping tools, mending doors, carving small treasures. He had no grand wealth, but his work carried pieces of his soul. When the moment for gifts arrived, the room grew still with anticipation. Clara's voice rang out cheerful and commanding. She gestured for her father first, as if to clear the smallest surprise before unveiling the grand ones. Elias pushed the wooden box toward her, his face softened by a faint smile. She opened it quickly, and her laughter rang through the hall. Inside lay a single scratch-off lottery ticket. "Father," she said, her tone laced with mockery, "a ticket of chance. Perhaps luck will do for you what hard work never could." The words cut sharper than she intended, but she did not stop. "If you win, remember, I deserve my half." The family chuckled nervously. Elias did not answer. He only bowed his head slightly, hiding the sting that burned behind his calm eyes. He slipped the ticket back into the box and closed it with quiet dignity. Then Clara stood and announced her gift to Victor. With a flourish, she unveiled an envelope bound with gold ribbon. Victor opened it to reveal a voyage across the Arctic seas, a luxury adventure valued at a small fortune. Gasps filled the hall. The room seemed to shift, every eye turning toward Victor, who smiled broadly and praised Clara's generosity. The contrast was undeniable. Elias sat with a worthless ticket in his hand, while Victor held the promise of oceans and wonders. The whispers began almost at once, murmurs of admiration for Clara's devotion to her husband's family, and murmurs of pity, even scorn for Elias. The cheap ticket seemed a symbol, a mark of his smallness in the eyes of those who now compared him to Victor's wealth and stature. Elias sat in silence, the laughter and toasts around him blending into a dull roar in his ears. The fire's warmth no longer reached him. In its place, humiliation pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating. He remembered the years of sacrifice, the nights spent in cold workshops to pay for Clara's schooling, the calluses that never truly left his hands. And now all of that was dismissed, replaced by a token gift of mockery and a public display of disregard. The dinner resumed, though the air had shifted. Clara leaned often toward Victor, seeking his approval, basking in his praise. Relatives clinked glasses, spoke of voyages and fortunes, and avoided the quiet figure at the far end of the table. Elias endured it all with the stoic patience that had carried him through a lifetime of hardship. But deep within, a seed of pain began to harden into something else. When the evening drew to a close, Elias rose, thanked the family in a voice steady but distant, and stepped out into the storm. The snow fell in heavy sheets, covering the ground in silence. The wind tore at his coat, but he welcomed the bite of the cold. At least it was honest. At least it made no pretense. He walked back to his small lodge on the edge of the village, the wooden box under his arm. Inside lay the ticket, dismissed and forgotten by all but him. He placed it on the mantel beside the fire, staring at it for a long time. It was nothing, and yet it seemed to burn brighter in his mind than all the riches Clara had paraded before him. The storm outside raged on, but within Elias the silence was deeper. He could not yet know what that slip of paper would bring, nor how it would tear open the shadows of betrayal hidden in his daughter's heart. For now he only knew that the night had carved a wound that could not easily heal. And as dawn approached, carrying with it the pale light of truth, Elias would soon uncover something far darker than a cruel joke. The storm eased by morning, leaving the town of Ashridge wrapped in a heavy silence. Snow clung to the rooftops and trees, and the streets glistened with ice that cracked under the boots of those who dared the cold. Yet in the taverns, in the baker's shop, and even in the post office, the warmth of gossip had already begun to spread. The talk was not of the storm, but of the gifts exchanged the night before. "They say Clara gave her father-in-law a voyage to the Arctic seas," murmured a shopkeeper arranging loaves of bread. "A voyage worth more than most of us see in a lifetime." "And to her own father?" asked a neighbor, raising an eyebrow. "A lottery ticket. Imagine that." The words moved from ear to ear, carried as swiftly as the wind that rushed down the mountain passes. Soon the entire village knew of the insult, though few spoke of it to Elias directly. Instead, when he entered the blacksmith's yard to collect supplies, men lowered their voices. When he passed by the market, women glanced at him with pity, some with disdain. The contrast had become the story of Ashridge Clara, the generous daughter-in-law, and Elias the father, pushed aside. Inside his lodge, Elias sat by the fire, listening to the creak of the beams above him. He had lived through winters harsher than this, through days when food was scarce, and nights when loneliness pressed heavy, but never had he felt such a coldness within. Each whisper in the village seemed to echo back to him, not as sound, but as weight. Still, he forced himself into routine. He worked the wood-shaping handles for tools, repairing broken furniture brought by neighbors. His hands moved with the certainty of long habit, yet his thoughts strayed always to Clara. Once she had sat beside him as he carved her small fingers, tracing the curls of wood, her questions endless. He had given her everything he could, his time, his earnings, his strength, and now she compared him to Victor Hale as though wealth and charm erased years of sacrifice. At gatherings the comparison grew sharper. Victor walked with polished boots and spoke of investments, of ventures across the seas, of opportunities that glittered beyond the mountains. Clara's eyes shone whenever he spoke, her laughter ringing brightly in his presence. To her, Elias was no longer the father who had raised her, but the relic of a life she was eager to leave behind. One evening, at a dinner hosted by Clara and her husband, the air was heavy with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. Relatives filled the long table once again. Elias, seated near the end, spoke little. He listened as Clara praised Victor for his wisdom, retelling stories of his business triumphs with the excitement of a disciple. When someone asked about Elias, Clara laughed lightly and said, "Father has always lived simply. He does not understand the world Victor comes from." The words were casual, almost playful, but they cut deep. A murmur of agreement passed around the table, subtle but clear. Elias pressed his hands against his knees to steady himself. He wanted to speak, to remind them all that without his labor Clara would never have studied in the fine schools that led her to this life. But the words clung to his throat, heavy with pride and pain. Victor, to his credit, offered a polite nod toward Elias. Simplicity has its virtues, he said, though the tone was one of courtesy rather than respect. Clara smiled at Victor as though he had offered a jewel. Elias bowed his head and said nothing. Afterward, as the guests drifted into the night, Elias lingered in the doorway. He watched Clara laughing with Victor beneath the lantern light, her arm looped through her admiration plain. For the first time, Elias understood that his daughter no longer saw him as her foundation but as a shadow, something to be tolerated but not honored. The whispers in the village only fed this truth. Clara has chosen well, some said. Victor will guide her family into prosperity. Others added, her father is proud, but what has he ever given her but calloused hands and an old lodge? Every word, every glance deepened the wound. Elias returned to his lodge night after night, the wooden beams above him heavy with silence. The ticket sat still on the mantel untouched, almost forgotten, a symbol of the insult that had begun it all. But one evening, while sorting through the small pouch of coins he kept hidden in a drawer, Elias decided to look over his bank ledger. It had been weeks since he had last opened it. The pages, lined with neat figures in his careful hand, told the story of a life measured in small earnings and careful savings. Yet as his eyes traced the numbers, his heart stopped. Something was wrong. Entire sums were missing, amounts far greater than he had ever withdrawn. He flipped back through the pages, his breath quickening. The numbers did not lie. Someone had taken what he had guarded all his life. A single thought struck him with the force of thunder. The voyage. The extravagant Arctic voyage. Could it be that Clara had not only insulted him with the cheap ticket, but also stripped him of the very money she used to honor Victor? The firelight flickered across his face as he sat frozen, the ledger trembling in his hands. His humiliation was no longer a matter of whispers and comparisons. It was a theft, a betrayal cut deeper than any insult. And as the wind howled outside the lodge, once more Elias realized that the storm was far from over. Elias sat at the small wooden table in his lodge, the storm outside, pressing against the windows like an unwelcome guest. The bank ledger lay open before him, its neat rows of numbers scarred by absences he could not explain. His hands, steady in the forge and strong in craft, now trembled as they turned the brittle pages. He had kept careful record for decades, each coin and bill accounted for, and yet here whole sums had vanished as though swallowed by the void. He pressed his palms against the table, leaning close to the lamplight. There was no mistake. Weeks ago, just before Clara's celebration, his savings had been withdrawn in a single staggering amount. He traced the line again and again, hoping it might change under his gaze. But it remained the same. The money he had saved through years of labor, through winters of hunger and summers of sweat, was gone. The thought that formed in his mind was unbearable. Could Clara have done this? Could his daughter, for whom he had worked until his bones ached, have taken his life savings to buy Victor Hale a voyage of luxury? He rose from the table, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He paced the room, the storm outside, echoing the storm within. The fire popped and hissed, shadows jumping along the walls. He thought of Clara as a child, her laughter, filling the lodge, her small hands clutching his as they walked through the market. He remembered the nights he had gone hungry so she could eat the tools he had sold so she might have books. And now all of that devotion had been repaid with betrayal. Sleep did not come that night. Elias sat in his chair, staring at the mantel where the lottery ticket lay. That slip of paper, once a symbol of mockery, now seemed bound to the deeper wound of his missing fortune. He clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. By dawn, his mind was set. He would confront her. The next afternoon, Elias walked to Clara's grand home, his cane striking the cobblestones with sharp rhythm. Snow crunched under his boots, and the eyes of neighbors followed him as he passed. Some nodded politely, others turned away. The whispers had grown louder in the village, but Elias did not pause to hear them. His heart was fixed on the truth. Clara opened the door with surprise. She was dressed finely, her hair pinned with silver combs, her smile practiced and bright. "Father," she said warmly, but her eyes flicked with unease when she saw the ledger in his hand. Inside the house glowed with warmth and wealth. Carpets muffled his steps. Chandeliers cast golden light across polished wood. It was a world far removed from his modest lodge, and yet it was his labor that had paved the way here. Elias wasted no words. He opened the ledger and held it before her. "Explain this," he said, his voice low but steady. Clara glanced at the page, then lifted her chin. "It was necessary," she replied simply. "Necessary." Elias's voice cracked with restrained fury. "That money was my life's work. You took it without asking, without a word." Clara folded her arms. "Father, it is family money. You would never use it. You live simply as you always have. But Victor, he is a man who can guide us into the future. The voyage was an investment in his goodwill and our family's prosperity." Elias's breath caught. "Prosperity," he repeated. "At the cost of your father's dignity, at the cost of the years I gave to you, the sacrifices I made." Clara's eyes hardened. "You speak of sacrifice as though it were a gift. It was your duty, father. Every parent provides. You should not hold it over me now." The words struck him like blows. Duty. Nothing more. All the nights spent in cold workshops, the years of aching muscles, the dreams he had set aside for her, dismissed as obligation. Elias stepped back, his chest tight. "You speak of duty, Clara, but what of gratitude, what of love?" Clara turned away, her voice cool. "Love does not build the future. Victor does. You cannot understand the world we live in now." Silence fell heavy between them. Elias looked at her as though seeing a stranger. The daughter he had raised with hope and pride was gone, replaced by ambition and greed. He closed the ledger, his hands trembling, and turned toward the door. Father, Clara called after him, her tone almost mocking. "Do not look so wounded. You still have your ticket, do you not? Perhaps fortune will smile on you at last." Her laughter followed him into the cold. Elias walked back to his lodge with slow, heavy steps. The village streets were quiet, but he felt the eyes of neighbors upon him. He knew the whispers would grow sharper now. Clara would not keep silent about this. Already he could imagine her version spreading, her father bitter, selfish, ungrateful. He would become the villain in her story. Inside his lodge, Elias dropped the ledger onto the table. His body ached with weariness, but his spirit ached more. The fire crackled, casting light on the ticket, still resting on the mantel. For a moment he considered throwing it into the flames, ending the reminder of her cruelty. But something held him back. Perhaps it was defiance, perhaps the faintest thread of hope. He sank into his chair and closed his eyes. The storm had quieted outside, but within him it raged stronger than ever. Clara's words echoed in his mind, hollow and cold. Duty, obligation, nothing more. The lodge seemed darker than ever before. Elias knew the betrayal was not the end of his suffering. It was only the beginning. The whispers in the village would turn sharper, the mockery more cruel. He would soon find himself not only betrayed, but isolated, cut off from the respect he had once known. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, Elias understood that the world he had built was crumbling around him. The days after Elias's confrontation with Clara stretched long and bitter. Winter pressed down on Ashridge with its full weight, the snow deepening along the streets, the air sharp with frost. Smoke curled from chimneys, warm fires glowed behind windows, but for Elias there was no comfort to be found. He had uncovered the truth, spoken it aloud, and in doing so had become a stranger in his own family. The whispers began quietly, like the first flakes of snow, barely noticed at first. In the market he felt them on his back, the half-hidden glances, the murmurs broken off when he turned. In the tavern voices dropped as he entered, then rose again after he left, sharper, now unkind. By the week's end the whispers had grown bold. "They say he resents his daughter's success," muttered one man near the butcher's stall. "Ungrateful old man," another agreed. "She gave him what she could, and still he complains." "I heard he accused her of theft," said a woman carrying bread. "Can you imagine his own child? What sort of father does that?" The words clung to Elias like frost biting through even the thickest coat of pride. He walked with his cane steady against the cobblestones, head held high, but inside he withered. He had faced hard winters, famine, and the slow decay of age, but never this, the slow erosion of his dignity by the very people among whom he had lived all his life. Clara's influence spread further still. In gatherings of relatives, she painted him as bitter, selfish, and unwell. She told them that age had clouded his judgment, that he saw betrayal where there was only love. She cast Victor as the true father figure of her household, the man of wisdom and generosity. And those who once respected Elias nodded along, unwilling to question the charm of wealth and the assurance of Clara's voice. His sister Margaret came to him one evening, her face pale in the lamplight. "Elias," she whispered, clutching his hands, "they speak of you cruelly in town. Clara tells them you are bitter, that you have lost yourself. I know it is not true, but the others, they believe her." Elias squeezed her hands gently, the only warmth he could muster. "Let them speak," he said, though his voice was thin. "Truth has no tongue when lies shout louder." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You do not deserve this." But Elias only shook his head. He had no strength left for anger. The days grew colder. Neighbors who once greeted him with smiles now crossed the street. Children whispered behind their mittens, calling him miser, calling him mad. Even the blacksmith, a man who had shared tools and laughter with Elias for decades now, avoided his gaze. The isolation was complete. At night, the silence of the lodge pressed in on him. The walls seemed to close tighter, the shadows longer. The fire crackled, but even its warmth felt distant. He sat often in his chair, staring at the mantel where the lottery ticket still lay. Once it had been a symbol of insult, then a reminder of betrayal. Now it seemed to mock him silently, a worthless scrap in a world where even his name was no longer worth defending. He thought of burning it many times, of watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames. Yet each time something stayed his hand. Perhaps it was defiance, a refusal to let even that small piece of Clara's cruelty control him. Perhaps it was hope, faint and foolish, that the ticket might yet prove more than a jest. But as the weeks passed, the weight of mockery grew unbearable. His tools gathered dust in the corner. Work dwindled as neighbors took their repairs elsewhere, unwilling to trust the hands of a man branded bitter and dishonest. His savings, already stripped, dwindled further until he lived on scraps and firewood gathered from the edge of the forest. One evening, as snow fell in thick silence, Elias ventured into town for bread. The baker, once a friend, handed him the loaf with eyes that refused to meet his. Behind him, two young men laughed loudly, their words sharp and deliberate. "There goes the old fool," one said, "too proud to thank his daughter. Too blind to see she saved him from his own misery," the other replied. Elias left without a word, the bread clutched in his hand, his breath a cloud in the frozen air. He walked slowly back to his lodge, each step heavier than the last. By the time he reached the door, his legs trembled with more than age. Inside, he set the bread down and lowered himself into the chair by the fire. His hands shook as he covered his face, the first tears in years slipping between his fingers. The man who had stood against storms, who had endured hunger and labor, now broke beneath the weight of voices. And yet, even in that darkest moment, the ticket remained on the mantel. The small slip of paper, forgotten by all but him, sat waiting. The storm of betrayal and mockery had nearly destroyed him, but fate, silent and patient, was not yet finished. Elias lifted his head, his eyes drawn to it. The firelight flickered across its surface. He did not yet know that within its numbers lay the power to turn his world upside down, to silence every mocking voice and expose every hidden lie. For now he only knew that his life had been reduced to whispers and shadows. But soon, very soon, the forgotten ticket would reveal its secret. The days dragged on, each one colder than the last. Winter in Ashridge showed no mercy, coating the rooftops with frost and filling the air with a stillness that seemed almost cruel. Elias's lodge stood on the edge of the village, like a sentinel left behind its chimney, sending up thin ribbons of smoke that the wind quickly tore apart. Inside, Elias lived quietly cut off, from the warmth of company, enduring the silence that mocked him as surely as the whispers in town. The lottery ticket still rested on the mantel. Most nights Elias hardly looked at it. To him it was a cruel reminder of Clara's insult, a token of her scorn disguised as a gift. He had thought of burning it countless times, yet it remained yellowing slightly at the edges, forgotten but never quite gone. One evening Elias sat by the fire, staring at the flames. The bread on the table was stale, the stew thin, but he ate without complaint. His eyes kept straying to the ticket. Finally, with a weary sigh, he picked it up. The paper was light, fragile, almost laughable in its worthlessness. He rubbed his thumb over the surface, feeling the raised grain beneath the numbers. "What foolishness," he muttered. "A scrap of paper, nothing more." With a small shake of his head, he set it aside. The wind outside rattled the shutters, and the snow whispered against the glass like cold fingers. He leaned back in his chair, letting the fire lull him into a restless doze. That night, as the storm howled, a crackle from the old radio jarred him awake. It sat on a shelf by the window, its wooden frame scratched, but still working. Elias had kept it more for company than news, the soft hum of voices breaking the silence. Tonight, however, the voice carried words that made his heart jolt. And now the winning numbers for the national lottery. Elias blinked, suddenly alert. He glanced toward the mantel where the ticket lay half buried beneath a pile of papers. The announcer's voice rang clearly, one number after another. Elias's breath caught. The first number matched, then the second, the third. His hands trembled as he snatched up the ticket, his eyes racing between it and the voice on the radio. Every number matched. He stared at the slip of paper in disbelief. His chest heaved, his heart pounding like a hammer in his ribs. The worthless scrap, the insult that had haunted him, was no jest at all. It was a fortune, a staggering fortune. The room spun around him. He gripped the table for balance, the radio's static filling the silence that followed the announcement. His mind reeled. Could it be true? Could fate be so cruel in one breath and so merciful in the next? He rose, pacing the room, his cane forgotten against the wall. His eyes returned again and again to the ticket in his hand, as though it might vanish if he looked away. He laughed once, a sharp, disbelieving sound, then pressed the paper to his chest. But as the first wave of shock passed, another feeling crept in fear. What if Clara discovered this? What if Victor learned of it? The same people who had stripped him of dignity, who had mocked him and spread lies, would stop at nothing to claim this prize as their own. Already Clara had taken his savings without shame. What would she do now, knowing that the ticket she had given him as an insult had transformed into unimaginable wealth? Elias sank into his chair, his hands shaking. He thought of the whispers in town of the neighbors who turned away, of the relatives who nodded along with Clara's lies. How quickly they would change their tune if they knew. How many would come knocking at his door with false smiles and open palms? No, he thought, clutching the ticket tightly. This cannot be known. Not yet. He rose slowly, moving to the far corner of the lodge where the beams met in a hollow space. With careful fingers, he pried open the wood, revealing a small cavity where he had once hidden coins in years of hardship. He folded the ticket gently and placed it inside, covering it again with the beam. Then he returned to the fire, his face pale, his breath unsteady. The night stretched long, filled with restless pacing and broken thoughts. Images flashed in his mind: Clara's mocking smile, Victor's polished boots, the cold stares of neighbors. He thought of what the fortune could mean: freedom, dignity, perhaps even revenge. But above all, he thought of the danger. By dawn, the storm outside had eased, leaving the village covered in a blanket of snow that glistened in the pale light. Elias stood at the window, staring out, his reflection faint in the glass. Behind him, hidden in the wood of his lodge, the ticket waited. He whispered to himself, "The world believes me broken. Let them believe it a little longer." But even as he said the words, he knew the secret could not remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, Clara would return. Sooner or later, the storm she had begun would clash with the fortune fate had placed in his hands. And when that day came, all of Ashridge would be forced to see the truth. For days after the numbers were announced, Elias moved like a man haunted by both wonder and dread. His lodge, once a place of silence and sorrow, now held a secret heavier than iron. Beneath the beams above his hearth, folded away in darkness, rested a slip of paper worth more than all the riches Victor Hale boasted of. Each morning Elias woke before the sun, the fire still glowing faintly in the hearth. He would rise, wash his face in the icy basin, and sit at the table with the ledger still open from the night he discovered his savings stolen. Yet now his eyes no longer lingered on the missing sums. They turned always to the mantel where the hollow beam kept its secret. More than once he lifted the beam to check that the ticket was still there. His fingers brushed over its surface as though touching it would make the truth more real. Each time he replaced it carefully, sealing it away as though it were not paper but a live flame that could burn him if mishandled. But with the joy of discovery came fear. Clara's voice echoed in his memory. "If you win, remember, half is mine." She had spoken in jest, with cruelty hidden behind her laughter, but Elias knew her greed too well. If she learned of the fortune, she would claim it as her own. And Victor, with his cold ambition, would stand at her side, demanding twisting truth to suit their hunger. So Elias told no one, not Margaret, though she had always been his confidant. Not the neighbors, though. They watched him closely now. The fortune was a flame he shielded with both hands, too precious to expose to the wind. The days became weeks, and in that time Elias began to plan. He could not remain in Ashridge forever. The whispers that had hounded him before now pressed harder, sharper, though none yet knew of his secret. He heard his name in the tavern in the market on the lips of men and women who had once greeted him with respect. Clara's influence had turned them against him, and though he held a fortune in silence, their judgment cut deeper than any hunger he had endured. Yet Elias did not falter. Instead, he began to imagine a future shaped by his own hands. He thought of the seaside villages he had once dreamed of, where boats rocked gently in the harbor and the air smelled of salt instead of smoke. He thought of the children who went to school without shoes, their parents bent beneath the weight of poverty, and he remembered his own sacrifices for Clara. Perhaps his fortune could lift others where his daughter had chosen not to honor him, but always as he shaped these dreams in his mind, the fear remained. Clara was cunning. She had already stolen his savings. If she so much as suspected, she would strike. One evening, as Elias sat by the fire, the ticket hidden away, he heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside. He froze, his hand tightening on his cane. The knock came sharp against the door. When he opened it, Clara stood there, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her smile practiced and false. "Father," she said warmly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The scent of her perfume filled the lodge, clashing with the smell of smoke and wood. "I have come to see how you fare. It grieves me to hear the village speak so poorly of you." Elias said nothing, only watched her with steady eyes. Clara continued, her voice smooth as silk. "I know you are angry with me. Perhaps I took more than I should have, but I did it for us, for the family. You must understand." Her eyes flicked toward the mantel, and Elias's heart clenched. Did she know? Could she sense the secret hidden there? He forced his face to remain calm, though inside the storm raged. Clara smiled faintly. "Have you used the ticket yet, the one I gave you? Perhaps fortune has smiled on you, father. Imagine how different life could be if it had." Elias's grip tightened on his cane, but he did not answer. Clara's words were bait a test, and he would not fall into it. At last she rose, adjusting her cloak. "You will come to see father. Victor and I can guide you into a better life, if only you let us. Do not cling to bitterness." When the door closed behind her, Elias sank into his chair, sweat dampening his brow despite the cold. She suspected. He could feel it in her gaze, the way her eyes lingered on the mantel. The secret was safe for now, but not forever. That night he did not sleep. He paced the floor, listening to the wind. He knew the storm was coming. Clara would not rest until she uncovered what he held. And when she did, the battle would begin, not just within the walls of his lodge, but across the whole village of Ashridge. He touched the hidden ticket once more, the paper trembling in his hands. Fortune had given him power, but power invited enemies. Soon he would have to step into the light. The secret weighed heavy on Elias, though no one yet knew the truth. Beneath the beams of his lodge, the ticket waited, a silent treasure holding more power than any sword or crown. But secrets have a way of whispering into the world, and in Ashridge, whispers traveled fast. It began with rumors. A neighbor swore they had seen Elias at the post office, clutching a letter with trembling hands. Another claimed he had been to the bank, though none could prove it. By the week's end, the village buzzed with talk. Elias Marrow had won something vast. Clara was the first to seize upon it. She appeared at his door once more, her cloak lined with fur, her smile as polished as glass. "Father," she said sweetly, "the town speaks of you. They say fortune has found its way to your door. Surely as your daughter I deserve to know." Elias met her gaze, his weathered face calm, but his eyes unyielding. "People will speak of anything," he replied. "Do not listen to gossip." But Clara's smile sharpened. "If you did win, father, you must remember your promise. You said once in front of us all that if fortune struck, half would be mine." The words cut deep, for Elias remembered her laughter when she had spoken them. It had been mockery then, but now she wielded it as a claim. He said nothing, only closed the door, leaving her in the snow. Clara did not accept silence as an answer. By the next day, whispers spread like wildfire. She told neighbors that her father had won the lottery, but was too selfish to share. She painted him as bitter, unstable, hoarding wealth that belonged to family. Victor Hale joined her chorus, his voice smooth and commanding. "It is a shame," he told townsfolk, "that a man who has so little dignity would withhold such fortune from those he should care for. My wife has done everything for him, yet he repays her with spite. The campaign grew. Clara wrote letters to relatives in distant towns, warning them that Elias was not the man they thought him to be. Victor spoke at gatherings, weaving tales of an old man corrupted by sudden riches. Soon the whispers became judgment, and judgment became certainty. When Elias walked through the market, people no longer whispered. They spoke openly. "There goes the miser," one man said. "He would rather let his daughter starve than share his winnings," another muttered. "I heard he stole the ticket back from Clara," a woman added. It was hers all along. Each word was a stone, heavy and crushing. Elias endured it with the same stoic silence he had carried all his life. But inside the fire burned hotter than ever. He had been stripped of his savings, mocked by his own child, and now turned into a villain before the eyes of his neighbors. The lodge grew lonelier by the day. Work ceased to come. Tools sat untouched, and food grew scarce. Yet even in hunger, Elias would not yield. The ticket remained hidden, untouched but not forgotten, a flame he refused to let Clara seize. One evening he returned from gathering wood to find Clara waiting at his door. She did not bother with pleasantries this time. Her cheeks were flushed with anger, her voice sharp. "Enough of this, father," she snapped. "The ticket was mine. I gave it to you, yes, but it was a jest, a promise between us. Everyone knows you owe me half, if not all. Give it to me now, or I will take it by law." Elias straightened the wood in his arms, dropping to the ground. "A gift is a gift," he said quietly. "You mocked me when you gave it. You cannot claim it back now that fate has turned." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You think the law will stand with you, an old man alone. Victor has friends. He has influence. We will make sure the world knows the truth." "The truth?" Elias asked, his voice low and steady. "Or your lies?" Her lips curled. "Lies are what people believe, father, and they already believe me." With that, she turned and strode into the snow, her cloak whipping in the wind. The following week, the smear campaign grew sharper. Clara filled the village square with her words, her voice ringing, as she painted herself as the devoted daughter betrayed by her father's greed. Victor added weight to her tale, speaking of honor, of fairness, of the duty of children to protect their parents, even as they twisted the story to make Elias the thief. The pressure was unbearable. Even Margaret, loyal and kind, came to Elias in tears. "Brother, the town believes her. They say you stole what was hers. They say you are selfish." Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you believe it?" She shook her head fiercely. "Never. But I am only one voice, and theirs are many." Elias's heart ached. He had lived with dignity all his life, but now dignity seemed powerless against the flood of deception. He knew Clara would not stop until she had torn everything from him. Yet fate, as always, had its own design. For while Clara and Victor wove their web of shadows, another figure watched silently from the edges. Richard Hale, Victor's estranged father, had been present at the gathering when the ticket was given. He had seen the laughter, heard the words, witnessed the insult. And though he had kept his silence until now, he could no longer bear the twisting of truth. Elias did not yet know it, but the storm that had risen against him would soon be met with an unexpected voice, a voice strong enough to shatter Clara's lies and turn the tide of Ashridge. The war of shadows weighed heavily on Elias. Each day seemed to bring a fresh insult, a new whisper, another blow to his dignity. Clara's voice was everywhere, echoing through the market, filling the ears of relatives carried like smoke from one household to the next. Victor stood at her side, tall and certain, his polished words painting Elias as a thief who clung to riches that were never his. Elias endured it with quiet resolve. He walked the streets with his cane tapping steadily against the stones, ignoring the glares, the mutters, the children's taunts. At night, he sat alone in the lodge, the fire casting flickering light on the hollow beam that hid his fortune. The ticket remained safe, but his heart carried wounds deeper than any the winters had carved. It seemed as though the entire village had turned against him. But fate, strange and unpredictable, often sends help from the most unlikely of places. One morning, as Elias fetched water from the well, a voice called out behind him, "Elias Marrow." He turned, and there stood Richard Hale, Victor's estranged father. Richard was a man of quiet stature, his hair silver, his coat worn from years of use. Unlike his son, he carried no air of arrogance, no polished shine of wealth. His eyes, though tired, were steady and kind. Richard Elias said cautiously. "What brings you to me?" Richard stepped closer, his breath clouding in the cold air. "I have heard enough," he said. "Too many lies have been spoken, too many truths buried. I was there the night Clara gave you the ticket. I saw her laugh. I heard her words. That ticket was a gift, and she cannot claim it otherwise." Elias's chest tightened. For weeks he had borne the weight of accusations alone, doubting even his own memory at times. To hear another speak, the truth felt like water to a man lost in the desert. "You would say this openly?" Elias asked, his voice low. Richard nodded. "Yes. Victor is my son, but I cannot abide dishonor. He and Clara twist the story to suit their greed, and the village believes them because their tongues are quick. But I will speak. I will tell what I saw." A silence hung between them, broken only by the creak of the well's rope. Elias studied Richard's face, searching for any hint of falsehood, but there was none. At last Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you may be the only voice strong enough to break their lies." Word spread swiftly. Richard Hale, the man long at odds with his son, had spoken out. At first people doubted. Why would he defend Elias? Why would he turn against his own blood? But Richard's reputation was not one of deceit. He had lived in Ashridge longer than most, known for fairness, for measured words. When he said that the ticket was given as a gift, his voice carried weight. In the tavern, whispers shifted. Richard was there. He saw it himself. Would he lie against his own son? No. If Richard says it, it must be true. Clara's fury was swift. She confronted Richard in the square, her voice sharp enough to cut stone. "How dare you undermine me?" she spat. "You would betray your own son to defend a bitter old man." Richard stood calmly, his hands folded before him. "I do not betray my son. He betrays himself with his greed. And you, Clara, betray the father who gave you everything." The crowd that had gathered murmured in shock. Clara's face flushed with rage, but she could not silence him. The first cracks in her story had appeared. Victor tried to salvage their campaign. He spoke of Richard as senile, his memory failing, his words unreliable. But the more he insisted, the less convincing he became. People saw the desperation in his eyes, the sharpness in his tone. For the first time, doubt crept into their minds. Elias watched this unfolding storm with cautious hope. He did not yet step forward himself, for he knew the time was not right. But to see Clara falter even slightly eased the weight on his chest. That night Margaret came to his lodge, her face alight with rare joy. "Did you hear?" she said breathlessly. "Richard has turned the village. People are beginning to question Clara. They say perhaps you were right all along." Elias allowed himself a faint smile. "Truth cannot stay buried forever," he murmured. But even in his relief, he knew the battle was not won. Clara was relentless. She would not yield simply because one man stood against her. If anything, her desperation would grow sharper, her schemes darker. And indeed, the very next day Clara and Victor announced that they would take their case to the public stage. They demanded a hearing in the hall of Ashridge, where officials could witness their claims, where the village could gather, and where Elias would be forced to defend himself. Elias stood at the doorway of his lodge, the cold wind tugging at his coat as Margaret told him the news. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun set in a blaze of fire behind the mountains. The time had come. He could no longer hide in silence. The ticket, the truth, and his dignity would soon be placed before the eyes of all. The hall of Ashridge awaited its great doors, ready to open its walls, ready to echo with voices of accusation and defense. Elias felt the storm gathering, fiercer than any he had yet faced. And in the shadows of that storm, the fate of father, daughter, and truth itself would be decided. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and brittle. Frost clung to the branches of the ash trees that lined the main street of Ashridge, and the bells of the hall rang out, calling the villagers to gather. People streamed through the snow, their cloaks drawn tight, their breath rising in pale clouds. Curiosity burned brighter than the winter Sunday. Today at last the truth would be tested before all. The hall of Ashridge was an imposing building, built of heavy stone, and crowned with a spire that seemed to scrape the sky. Its wide wooden doors stood open, spilling golden light across the square. Inside benches lined the walls, already crowded with villagers, their faces eager with expectation. At the front a raised dais held the officials, who would preside, their expressions solemn. Elias arrived alone. His cane clicked against the stone floor as he entered, his shoulders straight despite the whispers that greeted him. He moved slowly to the front, where a seat awaited. Every eye followed him, some filled with suspicion, others with doubt, a few with pity. Clara and Victor entered soon after their presence, commanding attention. Clara wore a gown of deep crimson, her chin high, her eyes sharp. Victor walked beside her, his coat immaculate, his every step measured. Together they looked like victors, already a pair confident in the story they had spun. Behind them came Richard Hale. His steps were slower, his coat plain, but his presence stirred murmurs in the crowd. The man who had spoken against his own son now prepared to speak again, this time before all. The hall fell silent, as the officials called the assembly to order. Clara was the first to speak. She rose gracefully, her voice carrying clear and strong. "My father has hidden the truth," she declared. "I gave him the winning ticket as a gesture of love, with the promise that we would share whatever fortune it brought. But when fate smiled, he turned against me, claiming it all for himself. He has twisted my kindness into betrayal." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara's words were practiced, her tone flawless, her eyes glistening with feigned hurt. Victor followed, his voice deep and measured. "I have watched this unfold with sorrow. Clara has done nothing but honor her father, while he has repaid her with cruelty. It is not only about wealth, but about respect, about a father's duty to his child. He has failed that duty." The villagers murmured among themselves, nodding, whispering. The tide seemed to turn once more against Elias. At last it was his turn. Elias rose slowly, leaning on his cane. His face was pale but steady, his eyes sharp with resolve. He looked not at the officials nor at Clara, but at the gathered crowd. "My daughter speaks of love," he said, his voice rough but clear. "But what love mocks a father with a worthless ticket, then steals his savings to honor another man? What love spreads lies until a village believes its own neighbor a thief? That ticket was given as a jest, not as a promise. A gift, no matter how small, belongs to the one it is given to." He held up the ticket, retrieved from its hiding place at last. The crowd leaned forward, their eyes wide. The slip of paper seemed to glow in the lamplight, fragile yet powerful. Clara's face tightened, fury flashing beneath her mask. "He lies," she cried, her voice breaking through the hall. "He twists my words, he—" But Richard Hale rose before she could continue. His voice, though quieter, carried the weight of truth. "I was there," he said firmly. "I saw it with my own eyes." Clara placed the ticket in her father's hand and laughed. She mocked him, spoke of fortune as though it were a joke. I heard her say that half would be hers if he won, but her tone was just not promise. We all knew it then. To claim otherwise now is deceit. The hall erupted in gasps. Richard's words cut through the fog of lies like a blade. Clara's composure cracked. "You would betray your own son," she shouted at Richard. Richard's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "I betray no one. I speak only the truth. And the truth is this: Elias Marrow is the rightful owner of that ticket." The crowd shifted, whispers swelling into open voices. Doubt hardened into belief, suspicion into shame. Eyes turned to Clara, no longer admiring but accusing. The officials conferred briefly, their decision clear. They rose and declared before all: the ticket was given as a gift. The winnings belong solely to Elias Marrow. The hall erupted, voices clashing, some cheering, some shouting. Elias stood silent, the ticket still in his hand, his heart heavy yet unbroken. Clara's face twisted with rage, her cries drowned by the crowd's uproar. Victor pulled at her arm, his mask of composure slipping. Elias bowed his head slightly, whispering words only he could hear. "The truth has spoken." But even as relief washed over him, he knew the battle was not finished. Clara and Victor had been humiliated, but humiliation is a spark that can set fire to the desperate. Their alliance, strained and fraying, was about to shatter before the eyes of Ashridge. And from that shattering darker storms would rise. The weeks after the public reckoning at the hall of Ashridge were uneasy ones. The village no longer mocked Elias, for the truth had been laid bare for all to see. Whispers that once stung now turned to murmurs of shame, even pity. Shopkeepers greeted him with quiet respect. Neighbors nodded as he passed. And children, once cruel in their innocence, now watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. But for Clara the fall was devastating. The lies she had woven had unraveled in front of the entire village. Victor's composure had cracked, and though he tried to shield himself with pride, the damage was done. Their alliance, once so powerful, had broken in full view of all. Where once she had walked the square with her head high, now Clara moved like a shadow, her steps hurried, her eyes darting from corner to corner, as if she feared every whisper was a dagger aimed at her heart. Elias, though vindicated, found little joy in it. The betrayal of his daughter lingered heavier than all the judgments of the village. He spent his days in the lodge repairing tools, carving wood, and staring often at the framed ticket now resting on his mantel. The fortune it had brought him was vast, yet the wound it carried was deeper still. Then one bitter evening Clara returned. The knock on his door came sharp against the howl of the wind. Elias rose slowly, his cane steady, and opened the door. Clara stood there, her cloak ragged, her eyes red from weeping. Snow clung to her hair, and her hands trembled as she clasped them together. "Father," she whispered, her voice cracked. "Please, let me in." Elias stepped aside, though his heart was heavy. She entered the warmth of the fire, brushing her pale face. For a long moment she said nothing, only stood before the flames, her shoulders shaking. At last she turned to him, her eyes filled with desperation. "I am ruined," she said. "Victor has abandoned me. Debts weigh upon me like chains. The house is no longer ours. I have nothing, Father, nothing but you." Elias listened in silence. Clara moved closer, her voice rising with urgency. "You have wealth now, more than enough for both of us. Please, Father, I beg you, lend me what I need. Give me a share and I will rebuild. I will save my family. Without you, I am lost." Her words fell heavy in the quiet lodge. Elias looked at her, and for a moment he saw not the woman who had betrayed him, but the child she once was. The girl who had laughed at his side as he carved toys, who had clung to his hand in the market. His heart ached with memory, but the pain of her betrayal was sharper still. "You speak of family," he said softly, "yet, when you had the chance, you cast me aside. You took what was mine, you mocked me before the village, you sought to ruin me. And now only when you stand in ashes do you return." Clara fell to her knees, her tears staining the floor. "I was blind, Father. Ambition consumed me. Forgive me. Do not let me fall into ruin." Elias's voice did not rise, but its firmness filled the room. "I cannot reward betrayal. If I give to you now, what lesson is learned? You chose greed over love, lies over truth. And now you ask me to mend what you have broken." Clara lifted her face, streaked with tears. "If you do not, you will never see me again. You will never see your grandson. Is that what you want?" The words struck him like a blade. He thought of the boy innocent in all of this, caught in the shadows of his mother's choices. For a long moment Elias said nothing. The fire crackled, the wind howled against the shutters, and the silence between them stretched thin as glass. At last Elias spoke, his tone heavy with sorrow. "If you would use a child as a weapon, then you have already severed the bond yourself. I will not yield to such cruelty. If you walk away, that is your choice, not mine." Clara's face twisted with fury, her tears turning bitter. She rose to her feet, her voice sharp with anger. "Then you will die alone, Father. And when you do, you will know it was your own pride that left you empty." She turned, her cloak swirling, and stormed into the night. The door slammed shut, and Elias stood alone once more, the echoes of her words lingering like smoke. He sank into his chair, his body heavy with grief. The fortune he held had given him power, had restored his dignity before the world. But it could not heal the wound of his daughter's betrayal. That wound he knew would remain for the rest of his days. The firelight flickered across the framed ticket, its numbers gleaming faintly. Elias stared at it for a long time, whispering into the quiet, "Wealth cannot buy what love has lost." Outside, the snow fell thick and silent, covering the tracks Clara had left behind. The village slept, but within the lodge Elias knew his life had changed forever. The bond that had once defined him was broken, and only the dawn would reveal what path remained. The night after Clara stormed from the lodge was long and heavy. Elias sat before the fire until the embers dulled into ash, his thoughts drifting between sorrow and resolve. Outside, the snow piled high against the windows, but inside he felt a different kind of winter settling in his chest. The bond between father and daughter had cracked beyond repair, and no amount of wealth or words could mend it now. In the silence he thought of all that had passed. The night of humiliation in the lodge, The theft of his savings, the endless whispers that had nearly broken him, the fortune discovered in a forgotten ticket, and finally the storm of lies that had tried to strip him of dignity. Each trial had cut deep, but he had endured. And though Clara had chosen her path of greed, Elias knew he could not remain in the shadows of betrayal forever. When dawn broke pale and fragile across the snow, Elias rose with a decision. He packed what little he needed, his tools, some clothing, a few keepsakes. The framed ticket he wrapped in cloth and tucked carefully into his satchel. It was not for boasting, but as a reminder, a symbol of both his suffering and his survival. With slow but steady steps, he left the lodge that had sheltered him through storms and loneliness, and he turned his face toward the horizon. The journey was not easy. Winter's grip was harsh, and his body ached with every mile. Yet the thought of a new life urged him forward. At last, after days of travel, Elias reached a coastal village where the air smelled of salt, and the sea stretched wide and endless. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, gulls cried above the waves, and the people moved with the rhythm of tide and wind. It was a place of simple work and honest living, far removed from the cold ambitions of Ashridge. Here Elias began again. He purchased a modest home near the shore, its windows opening to the sight of the sea. With his savings and the fortune he had kept hidden from prying eyes, he built a small workshop by the water. Each day he worked with wood once more, mending boats, shaping oars, restoring vessels that others had abandoned. His hands, though weathered, found new strength in the craft that had always been his refuge. Word of his skill spread quickly through the village. Fishermen came with broken hulls and splintered decks, and Elias repaired them with care. Families brought heirlooms of wood, asking him to breathe new life into what they thought lost. In every piece he touched, Elias left a part of himself, not for profit, but for the quiet satisfaction of creation. But he did not stop there. The memory of Clara's betrayal and of his own sacrifices long forgotten pushed him to think of others who suffered in silence. With a portion of his fortune, Elias established a small foundation for struggling families, especially those led by single parents. He provided tools, training, and resources so they could stand on their own feet, so no child would grow up believing sacrifice was merely duty without love. The villagers, once strangers, grew to respect him deeply. They did not see him as a man defined by wealth, but as one who gave freely and worked humbly. In time, Elias became not just a craftsman, but a figure of quiet strength, a man who had endured storms and found peace beyond them. Still, there were nights when memories of Clara returned. He thought of the girl she had been, the laughter of her youth, the hope he had once held for her. The pain did not vanish, but it softened into sorrow rather than rage. He no longer wished her ruin, only that she might one day see the path she had chosen and find her way back to grace. Years passed. The framed ticket hung on the wall of his workshop, not as a boast of fortune, but as a testament to survival. Visitors often asked about it, and Elias would smile faintly and say, "It is a reminder that even in betrayal, life can grant us a chance to rise again." He grew older, his hair silver, his steps slower, but his spirit remained steady. The sea became his companion, the sound of waves, his comfort, the cries of gulls, his music. And though the scars of his past never fully healed, Elias lived the rest of his days with dignity, surrounded not by wealth or false praise, but by honesty, respect, and the quiet joy of a life reclaimed. The story of Elias Marrow became a quiet legend in the coastal village. Children grew up hearing of the old man who had been mocked with a worthless ticket only for fate to turn it into a treasure. But the true lesson was never about the fortune itself. It was about resilience, about standing firm in the face of lies, about refusing to let betrayal define who you are. And when Elias's time finally came, he left behind not only his wealth, but a legacy of kindness, strength, and truth. His life had been scarred by shadows, yet he had found his dawn. This tale reminds us that betrayal, though painful, does not have to break us. Wealth and fortune may come and go, but dignity, resilience, and truth are treasures that cannot be stolen. Elias's journey shows that even when the people closest to us turn against us, we can still rise, rebuild, and create a life of meaning. Sometimes the deepest wounds carve the path to our greatest strength. If this story moved you, do not forget to like this video, share it with others, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story filled with lessons of life, resilience, and hope.